Hello, welcome to Oak Grove Media and Film. In today's video, we are going to be focusing on Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys from 1987. This is a film that comes up on paper 1 of the Film Studies GCSE by the exam board EDUQAS or WJEC. This film comes up in section A of paper 1 alongside Dracula from 1931. You will receive a set of questions on Dracula, also then on The Lost Boys, and then finally you'll be asked to compare the two films on some area of commonality. Before we go any further though, if you could take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you are interested in receiving any more content like this, which is there to support your GCSE and A-level studies. So let's start off with the contexts around this film from 1987. 1980s America was a time of excess. The early part of the decade saw a significant recession, and it was, even at the time, compared to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the president of the time, Ronald Reagan, made it his mission to come in and cut taxes in an effort to boost public spending. And this did gradually work. This trickle-down economic plan did eventually work. However, for those in society who could afford to spend, there was this sort of consumer boom. People were spending more money than they'd been spending before. Everybody was interested in the latest fashions, the latest trends, owning the latest gadgets. But when you cut taxes, that money has to come from somewhere. And so money that had been spent on welfare systems and support for the most vulnerable and the poorest in society was either significantly reduced or it was pulled entirely. So this meant that at this time of excess and this time of consumerism, you have got a subset of people being left behind. And when you're talking about a country as big as America, that is not an insignificant number. So there was this divide that was really growing more and more significant as time progressed between the richest in society and the poorest in society. In addition to this, during the 1980s, there was a moral panic around the subject of drugs. The 80s saw an influx of crack cocaine making its way onto the American streets that was being smuggled from a number of South American countries. This caused unease amongst the general public in America, especially the older people in America at the time. The government backed an initiative to try to get some messaging out to young people to just say no to drugs in an effort to curtail and to warn people of the dangers. But the general sentiment in America was that the youth were being corrupted and they needed saving. And speaking of the youth at the time in America, there was in the 1980s a feeling of disconnect, and the youth culture felt misunderstood by the older people in society. So you started to see more and more like breakaway groups and subsets of youth culture, like the punk movement, for instance, happening, and there was this sense of rebellion from teens of America at the time. So finally, the 1980s saw the AIDS crisis in America and around the world. This was a disease that brought with it a lot of misconception and misunderstanding in these early years. And as a result of that, there was a lot of fear around this disease, which could be transmitted through contact with bodily fluid. It wasn't really until there was some high-profile deaths from the disease that the government actually started to take it seriously and started to put money into research around the disease and ways it could be prevented, or people could be protected from it. Initially, it was seen as something that was a problem in the gay community, and there was a lot of ignorance and prejudice as well around the disease, and the proper resources weren't put in place early enough until it became, an issue that affected the wider community. And these are obviously sort of failings of the social attitudes of the time, but it is worth noting, considering some of the content in the film that we're looking at today, The Lost Boys. So what we're going to have a look at today is actually a couple of key sequences which I think are perhaps most reflective of some of the contextual issues that I've just gone over. I will also be talking a little bit about genre conventions as well, because that might be something that's worth noting at this point, and comparing back to Dracula, as obviously they are both part of the same subgenre of horror, the vampire horror film, albeit Lost Boys does employ a little bit more comedy than Dracula does. But I do think, as I say, two sequences do help to encapsulate those contextual issues quite well. So we're going to have a look at the opening sequence, the title sequence specifically, which happens after the cold open when you're introduced to David and the Lost Boys. The title sequence introduces Michael and his family, so his mother and his brother, and we're also going to have a look at Michael's initiation, so when he is in David's lair and he drinks David's blood. Okay, so this is the title credit sequence for the film. We're introduced to the family through the use of this diegetic dialogue, and it's in the form of a sound bridge here because we hear them before we see them. But the sort of playful banter between them establishes quite a positive relationship between the two sons and the mother. I don't think I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about context, about the fact that, let's just pause this here, about the fact that 1980s America, there has been, in the previous decades as well, this steady increase in divorced people, and therefore single parent families were ever increasing, and attitudes had changed by the 1980s compared to, we're thinking about Dracula's era in the 1930s, but I mean, certainly 30s, 40s, 50s, where there was a much more negative attitude towards divorce. It was more taboo at that time, but by the time we're here in the late 80s, it's perhaps become more accepted, and Joel Schumacher chooses to depict here a really positive and loving relationship between the mother and her sons, albeit that there is a slight sort of disconnect between the mum and Michael, as he is, in his late teens, and there is maybe a sort of sense of him feeling like he's misunderstood to a certain degree. But even though we get those scenes later on where she's trying to speak to him in a meaningful way, and he's not giving her very much back, it is still a very loving relationship, and she is really trying to kind of like reach out and understand him. So I feel like that's more reflective of the times and of the fact that we are getting this really positive representation of a single parent family. So with the billboard here, we're obviously sort of establishing where we are, and we get our first little bit of foreshadowing here with the murder capital of the world on the back of the billboard. Now, let's just pause that here. We've got a use of transdiegetic sound here. So transdiegetic sound is where we sort of start the sound off. In this case, they've switched a song on in the car, and we've got the track People Are Strange, and then it continues over the montage, so it becomes non-diegetic sound over the montage, so we get that sort of seamless use of the sound, and it's appropriate as well. The lyrics of the song, if you listen to them, we get little hints of the some of the themes in the film. So do take the time to have a listen to the lyrics and think how they potentially are reflective of the narrative events in the plot. So we get a montage of shots of the people of Santa Carla. And I think it's probably worth noting that we have all of these different people who are reflective of the different privileges, I guess, in society. So we've got, if I just carry on playing a little bit here, you've got the people who have and who are part of, society, part of, mainstream culture. They're dressed in fashions of the time. It's very bright, it's very vibrant. People are walking in groups, are together, and then in amongst that you get these single shots, and there are plenty of them in here, with people wearing darker clothing, maybe more alternative fashions, like the sort of punk look, and they're often isolated, or they might be in a pair, but they're separate from the rest of society, and it shows that disconnect that I mentioned earlier in the youth culture, and this idea of not feeling understood or part of mainstream society. So Joel Schumacher is using the montage editing to draw those comparisons between the different types of groups in society at the time. We also get as well, if we're talking about narrative, we are getting all of this exposition information through the visuals. So we've just had, these shots of these missing posters there's a significant amount of them as well. So it makes it seem that there is obviously something going on here. We get the hint of the horror through the mise en scène and the cinematography as well, by choosing to let us see these posters in these tight close-ups. The other thing that we're going to see in a moment is this. So I mentioned earlier about this divide in the consumer boom, where you've got people who were really thriving in late 80s economy, but you've also got these people who are left behind, so the poorest in society being left behind, and the gap widening between the rich and the poor. And you've got, in this montage, Joel Schumacher slams these images together to show us these two very different sides of society. So you've literally got these kids rifling around in the rubbish and pulling food out of it, and you can see that they're disheveled, they're dirty looking, and they obviously have very little, but a couple of shots before we were seeing people sort of screaming on fairground rides, and obviously people enjoying the sort of seaside area and spending their money. So it's a really interesting sort of use of visuals to show us these two different sides of society. Okay, so next sequence we're going to have a look at is Michael's initiation. So this sequence is what we would refer to as the inciting incident in the Lost Boys plot, and what that means is it is the moment in Act 1 of the film where the course of the story is going to change because of a significant event. So in this case, Michael drinks David's blood, and that is what propels us into the rest of the film, because that obviously has a consequence in the fact that it turns him, and it's about trying to figure out how to stop that process and how to ensure that he is able to go back to just being, human, and ultimately bringing down the Lost Boys as well. Now, we get right here something that we actually see in Dracula as well, and it's a use of visual pathetic fallacy in the mise en scène. We've just had a diegetic crack of thunder as well, and we see this storm. So it's this metaphor, visual metaphor for foreshadowing, this warning of what is about to happen, like something terrible is about to happen, and we get that sense of impending doom just from the establishing shot here of the storm outside. As I say, it's probably worth noting about the fact you can compare that back to Dracula, because Dracula also uses this technique when the Count is aboard the Vesta and he's headed to England. In that sequence, before we get into the interior of the ship, we see the ship on stormy waters. So it's a similar technique being used as a way of foreshadowing the events of the horror. Okay, so we have got here another staple of vampire horror, which is the isolated location, which again we see in Dracula with the house, the Count's house on the top of the cliffside in Transylvania. Here we've got this, cross between, I guess, like a teen hangout, but also definitely looks like a villain's lair. It is this isolated location on the outskirts of the town, and it's in this cave network as well, so it does lend itself to looking pretty creepy. Cinematography wise, we have got interesting use of lighting to create that eerie atmosphere. So we can see one of the Lost Boys lighting these fire in these sort of trash cans or whatever. So that's practical lighting, we would refer to that as, because we've got the light source on the set, and it creates this glow, but which means that we can see everything that's going on. But we also get these really deep, dark pools of shadows where the firelight doesn't quite reach to, and that helps to create something that's a little bit more sinister, a little bit more creepy, and apt for the genre of horror. In addition to that, we also get, which we can see a little bit better in this next shot, we get these hard white lights that are coming in beams. I would assume that is meant to be representative of moonlight, these sort of streaks coming in, and then we've got also the sort of mist swirling around as well. So all in all, the aesthetic effect is that it creates something that's a little bit sinister looking, and as I said before, apt for the genre, certainly.
Not bad, huh? When the big one hit San Francisco.
These shots that are following Michael around, so we've got, I would assume it's a Steadicam shot that's being used here, maybe a track and dolly, but following Michael around, using the cinematography to establish him as the central character, this leader. And I'll talk a little bit later about the fact that one of the genre conventions of vampire horrors is that we have charismatic antagonists, and he very much comes across as this very engaging character, and he's obviously sort of central to the Lost Boys. He is their leader, and he's the sort of alpha male in this situation, but we definitely get hints of that through Joel Schumacher's use of microelements.
Ground opened up, this place took a header right into the crack. So now it's ours. So check it out.
Just pausing for a moment to look at the mise en scène which helps to communicate the fact that these are not your typical teenagers. They have potentially been around for a while, so we're constantly working on these hints of them being, the undead vampires, boys that don't grow up, which is why they're called the Lost Boys. But we have got, just in the background here, on the back of the cave, a poster of Jim Morrison from The Doors. We have also got the stereo here, which, believe it or not, was very high-tech for the time. These types of stereos, which were portable, you could carry them around with you. They were battery operated, but they were the latest bit of tech, and certainly young people were the people that you know that would carry these around and that they had them. So we get those little contemporary touches, but mixed in with that, you've got this Gothic imagery as well. So this is the broken chandelier that we've got in this ornate fountain, and then as we sort of go round the rest of the cave, there's also sort of candelabras, so it gives it this real gothic feel, and that is definitely an aesthetic that we associate with the vampire horror film genre, or subgenre, sorry. So I do think it's quite interesting that Joel Schumacher has put the two visual influences together, the Gothic with the contemporary, to show us potentially that these guys have been around for a while, and we get this sort of sense of, you know, eclectic mise en scène to show that they have been accumulating this stuff over a number of years. So we've got here as well, like David is offering Michael drugs here, which he does accept. So potentially another reflection of what was happening in 1980s society, some of these societal fears that I mentioned earlier around youth culture and the use of drugs, we can see being reflected here. And I don't know if, you know, Joel Schumacher is trying to draw any kind of moralistic, messaging from this moment, but David is a corrupting character. He has ill intentions, and is obviously not a good person. He is a monster, but he's the one that offers the drug. So take from that what you will. It may mean something, or it might just literally be Joel Schumacher showing the realities of what it was, youth culture was like in the 1980s. Okay, I'm going to pause here just to talk a little bit about cinematography choice again. We have got Joel Schumacher using the lighting to indicate that David is our sort of central figure. He's the leader of this group, because we have, and I know this is a medium close-up, but you can see in some of the wider shots that he is the only one who is illuminated by this hard, bright white light, and it obviously singles him out and draws the eye to him. And I was mentioning earlier about this idea of charismatic antagonists and how important that is, or how typical that is to the vampire horror. So yes, certainly our eye is drawn to him. But the other thing that I was thinking about was the fact that usually these hard white lights I would often associate with something heavenly or angelic, in the world of cinema. But because you get the hard white light coupled with the costume and the look of the actor, so the sort of layers of black that he's wearing, you've got the very sort of wide shoulder pads which give him quite an angular look as well, and then the spiky hair, and the fact it's kind of like this hard bleach blonde as well. He's got quite intense eyes. All of those things coupled with the white light, instead of creating something that looks angelic and heavenly, it actually looks quite supernatural, like otherworldly, by coupling those two things together. And I think it's something to do with the juxtaposition that it creates.
You're eating maggots. How do they taste?
Okay, let's have a look at this bit with a bottle. So we have the close-up that then follows or tracks the bottle to indicate to the audience that this is a significant item. And if you weren't sure if it was a significant item, they've made doubly sure that you are aware of that by having it in this gold casing with jewels on it, and it looks almost ceremonial, so it becomes very clear that this is an important item. And then in addition to that, don't know if you heard it, but there was a diegetic crack of thunder as well. So there's also the suggestion that it's not good what's heading this way. So David opens it here, and Schumacher uses a pretty dramatic looking push-in as he, there you go, as he drinks from the bottle. We mentioned, or I mentioned earlier about the AIDS crisis and this idea of fears around catching the disease through the exchange of bodily fluids, and a lot of the fears that were present in society at the time. Again, if you wanted to, even though the film doesn't explicitly ever talk about AIDS or the AIDS crisis, you could potentially associate some meaning to some of the fears that we get around the drinking of blood in this film, and what it does to people, or how it can destroy the lives of individuals. So again, you could maybe make some connection to some of societal fears at the time in America. So a little bit more here on charismatic antagonist. So we have got the actor Kiefer Sutherland has been cast as David, and he is a very charismatic actor, and that really plays into the need to have an antagonist that you can believe can charm people and can bend people to his will as well. We know from hopefully watching Dracula that part of the vampire lore is that they are capable of hypnotizing, and there is something really engaging and quite hypnotic about Kiefer Sutherland's performance. So you can see here the sort of direct eye contact, there's real intensity there, and he has got a very smooth sounding voice as well. There is something really engaging about him to watch, and I think, as I say, part of that is to do with the intensity of the actor as well, but it makes it sort of easy to understand why somebody like Michael, who's maybe feeling a bit disconnected, who's feeling a little bit lost, might be compelled to be part of this group, to be part of this gang. And he obviously goes ahead and drinks despite the fact that Star tries to warn him. You've kind of got the epitome of peer pressure here as well, as the Lost Boys chant his name. And he falls for it pretty much. And then diegetic sound of the thunder cracking again. And now we get non-diegetic drum music coming in to suggest that, this is a significant moment and something bad has happened as well. So these cross dissolves that we get with the slow motion, and then we get Michael kind of is in the middle of the shot here drinking more of the blood. We're kind of being encouraged to assume his position, like we're aligned with him in this moment, because the non-diegetic music coupled with the slow motion, the cross dissolves, it creates something that feels a little bit I guess it's meant to be reminiscent of how he's feeling. It feels the time is slowing down. You're starting to feel kind of dizzy, woozy, and you kind of get that through as I say, the use of the slow motion. You can see kind of guys running around in circles behind. So we've been encouraged to sort of like feel like him in this moment, as if we've been drugged or if we're drunk, and then we get the music coming in from the start of the film, which we might associate with the guys killing the security guard. And we end with the cross dissolve layering in David, and he becomes this overwhelming figure. So Star kind of gets pushed to the back of those layered shots, and David becomes everything, and he has basically got him. He has full control and influence over him, and we get that through the we understand that through the editing there. Okay, that's it for another video from Oak Grove Media and Film. Please do remember to like and subscribe to the channel for further content. Until next time, bye bye.